And I think my answer is yes, it was. There's no question but that the prevailing interpretation of the war's origins is a Manichaean one. That what we have here is a contest that poses good against evil. And therefore, there is an obligation on the part of our country and like-minded countries to oppose evil. I would argue that that's too simplistic, that we cannot understand why this war began without acknowledging the legitimacy of Russian national security interests, and indeed the legitimacy of the Russian argument that Russia can be secure only if it controls a sphere of influence, and a sphere of influence that will necessarily include Ukraine. The United States and its allies refused even to discuss that possibility. The Secretary of State explicitly said the United States doesn't believe in spheres of influence. Of course, that's simply not true. Far closer to the truth is the fact that the United States basically claims a global sphere of influence, or at least a broad one. Consider the response of the United States in 1962 when it discovered that the Soviets were installing offensive weapons in Cuba. That was immediately rejected by the United States because the Soviets were interfering in our sphere of influence, as claimed under the terms of the Monroe Doctrine. So I cannot say, I think no one can say, that the war could have been avoided by acknowledging that Russia does in fact have legitimate security interests that ought to be respected. But I think it is a viable argument that had the United States and its NATO allies been willing at least to consider what those interests consisted of, it might have been possible to avoid this catastrophic conflict.
We have a question related from Gerardo Otero. Once the war began, given NATO's unresponsiveness to Russia's perceived national security interests, could the Biden administration have taken a policy to promote peace rather than escalation?
Once the war began, the Biden administration's alternatives really came down to, I think, three. One is condemn Russian actions as illegal aggression. It's a reasonable argument, and therefore launch a counter-intervention in defense of Ukraine, risking the possibility of World War III. Second possibility, I think, was to follow the course of action they did, to provide material support, try to stiffen the amount of Ukrainian resistance, even though at the time, of course, most informed observers assumed that Ukraine would be quickly overrun. And I guess the third option would have been to stay out of the fight, Washington offering itself as an honest broker, but in all likelihood, a hands-off approach that would have allowed the Russians to achieve their military objectives. So Biden took course of action two. I think given the circumstances that existed once Putin gave the order to intervene, option number two was probably the least bad. Unfortunately, that option has not led to any clear understanding of how to bring this war to an end, which of course is the imperative of the moment.
We have another question from Lisette Blanks. When you say that foreign diplomacy must change for the United States, where should Americans focus, regardless of political views, to help out international relations?
Well, again, some may say that I am taking too narrow a perspective here, but it is my conviction that our country has sustained so much damage, many explanations or sources, but I think above all, damage caused by our ill-advised military policies of the post-Cold War era, that our number one obligation to our fellow citizens is to create opportunities to repair the damage. And that begins with, I think, avoiding further needless wars, such as those that have caused so much damage over the past 30 or so years. But that's not the question. The question is, well, what should the United States be doing? I personally think that the United States needs to offer itself as an honest broker in regional disputes that pose the greatest danger of instability, rather than choosing sides. That's our inclination. You know, in disputes between Saudi Arabia and Iran, to cite one example, we choose sides. We choose to align ourselves with Saudi Arabia. We choose to classify Iran as an enemy. That's an approach that works well for the military-industrial complex. It does not, in my judgment, work particularly well in trying to bring about the resolution of disputes between other countries. So we've been too quick to pick sides.